Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz. Brandis Friedman has the evening off. On the show tonight,
the most important thing is making sure that we get the endorsement of the voters.
A day-long campaign launch for the mayor's second term in office. We give you a breakdown of today's events.
There is something that people can do.
There's a way to keep guns from people deemed unsafe, but it is seldom used. Details on Illinois' red flag law. Our Spotlight Politics team looks at how the recall of San Francisco's progressive prosecutor, who was raised in Chicago, may affect races here. Climate refugees looking for more stable environments could flock to the Midwest, why some are calling Chicago a safe haven. As summer swings into full gear, a look at the state of Chicago's bicycle infrastructure and safety. Fantastical folk art creatures made a big debut at Wheaton's Cantini Park. And Orbert Davis talks about the larger-than-life legacy of Miles Davis. But first, some of today's top stories. A candidate for a top Cook County office has been kicked off the ballot despite early voting already underway downtown. A ruling from the 1st District Appellate Court states that Carmen Navarro-Jercone cannot run for Cook County Sheriff because she was, quote, statutorily unqualified to be elected to the office of sheriff at the time she filed her nomination papers. Last month, Jercone was allowed back in the race after initially getting kicked off of the ballot under a law that took effect just this year, requiring anyone running for sheriff in Illinois to be a certified law enforcement officer. Election day ballots are already printed with Jercone's name on it. A Chicago Board of Elections spokesperson says that votes already cast for Jercone will not count, and there will be signs at polling places telling voters that Jercone is not officially a candidate, pending any other guidance from the court. Now, current Sheriff Tom Dart is seeking his 5th term in office. The applicants are in to fill the vacant 24th Ward City Council seat. 19 people applied to replace former Alderman Michael Scott, including his sister Monique Scott, who works for the Chicago Park District as a park supervisor. Mayor Lori Lightfoot appointed a 3-person committee to recommend the alderman's replacement. Scott resigned earlier this month to take a position with Cinespace. Lightfoot has until August 6 to fill the seat. Chicago police say a man wielding a machete allegedly robbed several people on the Northwest Side over a 9-day period. Andre Gonzalez was ordered held without bail during a hearing this afternoon.
Officers and detectives worked around the clock utilizing video and interviewing witnesses to identify Gonzalez. The facts of the case were presented to the state's attorney's office and approved for the counts of armed robbery with a dangerous weapon.
Gonzalez is due back in court for a hearing on June 15th. And up next, a look at Mayor Lightfoot's whirlwind re-election tour across the city. So please stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabie Family, the POLK Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Mayor Lori Lightfoot wasted no time before hitting the campaign trail less than 24 hours after making her re-election bid official. Lightfoot spent today on a whistle-stop tour of the South and West Sides, and while she was greeted by friendly faces, she bristled at suggestions that she faces headwinds in her bid for a second term as mayor. WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. All right, so in all, Lightfoot made 5 stops today, all but one of them on the South or West Side. She was greeted by recipients of city grants, friendly members of the City Council, and endorsers. And amid the warm reception at these tightly scripted events, she pushed back on suggestions that she faces an uphill climb to become the first woman to be reelected mayor of Chicago. Take a listen.
I'm a black woman in America. People are betting against us every single day. We know we don't have it easy. We know that we're viewed by a different lens, but that doesn't mean we're not ready for the fight. No one else has a record of accomplishment, and particularly not through this kind of challenges, unprecedented, that we've had. And I am excited about the opportunity of telling that story to the residents of this city. Haters are going to hate. Right? Haters are going to hate.
Heather, why frame the re-election this way?
Well, Mayor Lightfoot is attempting to claim the mantle of an outsider who is fighting against the forces in Chicago that have contributed to the systematic inequity that she vowed in 2019 to reduce, but which of course remains very present. She's hoping also to make an asset of that combative personality that we have all grown so familiar with over the last 3 years and cast herself as a Chicago politician who's not afraid to throw some elbows if it means getting the job done for Chicagoans.
And we all remember her first campaign. The hallmarks here were Ed Burke running against aldermanic prerogative, ethics, corruption, police reform. Are there going to be similar kinds of campaign platform items that she'll run on this time?
Well, I asked her that question in 2 different ways today and didn't really get an answer. It's not clear what she's going to put at the heart of her pitch to voters for a second term as mayor of Chicago. And we will have to see as that develops, as of course she's already got 5 challengers and it's sure to be a hard-fought race.
Public safety, a huge issue, probably her #1 priority. Did she lay out any notion of a crime plan?
No, you're right. She said public safety and the reduction of crime was her #1 priority, but we didn't hear anything new from her today. She fiercely defended Superintendent David Brown as the right man to lead the Chicago Police Department, and she took another swing at the Cook County court system, saying that people charged with violent crimes must be held on pretrial retention, even though, of course, bail is a hallmark of our democratic system.
All right, Heather, thanks very much, and we will see you again later in the program for Spotlight Politics, where we'll talk much more about this.
Thanks, Paris.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website, WTTW.com/news. As members of Congress weigh potential measures to protect against mass shootings, one oft-mentioned option is a so-called red flag law. Illinois already has one, but does it work? Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda.
Yes, Paris, this is a debate that has taken on a true sense of urgency after a gunman armed with AR-15s recently killed 19 students and 2 teachers at that elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. The shooter had previously exhibited problematic behavior, sharing plans for a massacre on social media and other warning signs. And that is where some believe a red leg law could come into effect. I asked Jeffrey Swanson, he's with Duke Med School's psychiatry department and also the Duke Law School's Firearms Center, just what a red flag law is.
A popular term for what members of the policy nerd brigade like me refer to as an extreme risk protection order law. What it boils down to is it's a civil restraining order that gives police officers clear legal authority to remove firearms from a person who is manifestly posing a risk of harm to self or others.
Now, again, this is a civil measure, not a criminal one, and these restraining orders are time limited. In Illinois, guns could be stripped from someone deemed dangerous to themselves or others for anywhere between 2 weeks or a maximum of up to 6 months. That is a shorter time frame than in other states. 19 states do have red flag laws. State Representative Kathleen Willis sponsored Illinois back in 2018. She says, not to be glib, but you could think of it like a situation in a country western song.
That your dog got run over, your wife left you, and you lost your job. All those things, one at a time, you might be able to handle, but everything all at once could put you in a spin. And you probably shouldn't have a gun in your nightstand during those times. So this allows family members to be proactive.
Now, every state's measure differs some, but in Illinois, only a family member or somebody living with the individual is able to file a petition for a firearm restraining order. You don't have to have any sort of lawyer or attorney, and there's also no court fee. This is intentionally made to be both easy and quick turn. If a judge does agree that the petitioner has presented good evidence, then law enforcement will temporarily take away the individual's guns.
Red flag laws undoubtedly violate the Fourth Amendment, which is unreasonable search and seizure. And so a person is accused, they don't know they're accused, they haven't had their day in court, and all of a sudden the police or somebody comes and takes their firearms away, and they don't know what's happening.
Now, a gun owner does have an opportunity to protest that removal, and Illinois does require that a court take that up within 14 days' time. But the State Rifle Association's Richard Pearson says it would be folly to go to court without a lawyer in that regard. So even if the gun owner does succeed in that effort, it costs time and money. He says that an ill-meaning relative could file a red flag petition out of something like vindictiveness. He says all states should at least have protections like Illinois, in which someone who files a petition fraudulently could be charged with perjury, a means of making sure that there is no sort of vindictiveness used here. Now, Texas does not have a red flag law that would have allowed those close to him to seek action against the shooter before that mass shooting in Uvalde. But New York does have a red flag law. Pearson points out that did not stop the Buffalo shooter recently, despite his also having had exhibited warning signs and extremism. I asked Duke Swanson, do red flag laws work?
Very simple sounding question, and I wish it had a really simple answer. I would say they can work, and they do work, but I'm going to put some conditions around it, because they're not going to work if you just pass the law and nobody knows about it and nobody uses it. They have to be implemented. There has to be some infrastructure around it, or it's not. You might as well take your new bill and put it in a bottle and throw it in the ocean. Hope somebody finds it.
Enter Denise Wang-Stonebeck. She is a first-term state lawmaker who is now in a contest for re-election. She came into the General Assembly concerned that people were not using this tool, the red flag law, enough. CBS News cites court documents showing that emergency firearms restraining orders in Illinois were used only 51 times in 2020 and 37 times last year. Now, a law that took effect earlier this month, in fact, a week ago as of today, does require police to be trained annually on the red flag law, and also requires that the state public health department create an awareness campaign. The new state budget will allocate $1 million towards spreading the word about it.
We need to get the word out that there is something that people can do. If they hear of someone that is making threats, and we know that over half of mass shooters give at least one warning sign about what they're going to do before they actually carry out these gun massacres, then if we can get the word out that this is a resource, this is a tool in the toolbox that people have. If they're a family member, they can petition the court directly. And if they're not a family member, they can always go to law enforcement.
So as she hinted, there are other means of keeping a firearm away from somebody who could be dangerous. If you have a felony, for example, you're not going to be able to get a FOID card. And the red flag law also does, again, while Illinois' red flag law has that really small circle of those who can go to a court on an emergency basis, police do also have means to intervene. And then you have things like stalking or domestic violence orders that could lead to gun removal from somebody who is subject to them. So with that, Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. And we'll also see you later in the program for Spotlight Politics. But first, a new study concludes that Cook County has become one of the most desirable places for those escaping the extreme effects of climate change. Climate refugees seeking more stable environments look to cities across the Midwest. But is the Midwest really a safe haven? Here to talk about the impact climate change is having across the country and the influx of climate refugees are Sabina Scheck, Director of the University of Chicago's Program on Global Environment, and Karen Weigert, Director of the Baumhart Center for Social Enterprise and Responsibility at Loyola University. Thank you both for joining us. Sabina Scheck, this study came from the blog Hire a Helper, and it showed that 1% of people moving from their homes because of climate change moved to Cook County, and that placed it 7th on its list. What's your reaction to that?
Hi, thank you for having me, Paris. I think that it's a bit hard to disentangle the reasons that people move somewhere. So I think that attributing it to climate change is a little bit tricky to do. So I think that if you look at sort of population growth across the country, many of the cities and states that are experiencing the most significant population growth actually have some of the highest climate risks. And I think that these risks haven't yet outweighed the other reasons that people are moving. So we may see this going forward, but I think it's also really important to recognize that this burden of climate hazards is not equal. So particularly for people who can't relocate or can't move, and they sometimes get left out of the conversation when we talk about climate migration or climate refugees.
Yeah, some of these cities might have seen an outflow because of climate change, but probably saw a greater inflow for other reasons. Karen Weigert, that study concluded that about 40 to 50,000 people are leaving their high-risk counties per year. Where exactly are these cities, and what do you think that's going to look like in a year like 2050 and beyond?
Well, also, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you. It's obviously a critical conversation, and it's one where we have to take that step back and look at, what are the impacts of climate change, and ultimately, how can we prevent them? But if we look at the impact, certainly coastal areas have different challenges with sea level rise and with climate-fueled storms coming off the water. So those are very significant. And like Sabina was mentioning, those who have the fewest resources are impacted the most in situations like that. So you both have, the shock of a storm, and then you also have the chronic of sea level rise happening. And that's one example of the coast. Out west, you have extreme heat combined with wildfires. So there are different ways that climate change is felt across the country and ultimately across the globe. And it does vary by region. And we are definitely impacted by climate change here. But in many ways, those impacts have not reached that level of wildfires or of hurricanes. But we have absolute challenges around heat, around storms, and they're not equally felt even within our own city. So we'll see a lot of change, but I like the broader question about, how do we think about what's driving that change? How do we get ahead of what's driving it? And then how do we support those who are impacted now?
Sabina Scheck, what about the notion that Chicago or the Midwest being considered a climate refuge when you have studies that talk about the fast rise and drop in lake levels, flooding, and as we just mentioned, storms? Is this really a climate safe zone?
Yeah, we certainly talk a lot about water in Chicago, and rightly so. But Chicago actually has a deadly history with heat waves, and in fact, heat waves are the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the United States. So, to Karen's point, I think that people are particularly vulnerable when they're living without the appropriate cooling infrastructure, whether it's air conditioning or modern building design, or access to green space that can mitigate urban heat effects. So, I think how the Midwest, how Chicago prepares for this, both in cities and in agricultural areas, will have a big impact on what happens. And the burden of these impacts will be greatly disproportionate unless we pay attention to the conditions that have led to the existing, health, environmental, urban injustices as we plan for climate change.
And Karen Weigert, the Army Corps of Engineers is doing a study on the coastline because of Lake Michigan. What are the ways that a city like Chicago can start to get ahead of these questions to start mitigating the effects of climate change?
I put them in two really big buckets. The first one is, how do we reduce emissions? It's straight up, it's the same question for anyone on the globe. It's one of those extraordinary opportunities where carbon reduced anywhere helps all of us everywhere. So for the city, and then they've just come out with a climate plan, they're looking directly at how do we reduce emissions from buildings, from transportation, and then how do we do that in a way that is equitable, where we're really looking at how to create a green economy that is inclusive. And so there's an extraordinary amount of work there. For a city like Chicago, the majority of our emissions come from heating, cooling, and operating buildings, and they come from transportation. So those are very clear opportunities. But then that second part is, how do we begin to adapt to the changes that are already here? You talked about lake levels rising, and Sabina talked about heat and the history that we've had with heat events in the city. And so we have to do those two things of reduce our own emissions, but then also look at the changes that have already started and ensure that we're creating safe, healthy places for people throughout the city. And that means things like access to cooling stations on those hot days. And that means things like the city is intending to do, being very intentional about where you plant trees. So you're creating cooling in neighborhoods that might not have had as much access to cooling, because we're going to need more of it.
Sabina Scheck, we talk about climate refugees in the U.S., but what about across the world? No doubt in the next several decades, there might be tens or hundreds of millions of people that live in coastal areas that might become uninhabitable. What is that migration going to look like?
Yeah, I think, well, the term climate refugee is not a formally acknowledged term under the UN's definition of refugee, because that requires, the crossing of international borders. But aside from that technicality, I mean, there's mounting evidence of movement both within and across borders due to climate hazards and these accumulated events that lead to chronic conditions. So it's not we're not seeing, if we don't see like a big movement in response to a giant storm of some kind, we're seeing chronic conditions that are really making living in certain places difficult. So I think one thing that we really want to think about too is thinking about the way that we live and the way that we design the places that we live. So particularly cities, right? Denser urban environments mean more people. So we should be very intentional and deliberate about changing our infrastructure, our streets, our buildings, our transit, reducing dependence on fossil fuels, as Karen was talking about, but also thinking about that more broadly, like what are the types of social infrastructure that we need to reduce the inequitable burdens of climate change.
And as you mentioned, folks that might be leaving more uninhabitable places in the future might be the ones that can afford to, and the ones that stay behind are the ones that can't afford to leave. So those are lots of considerations to think about. And for now, our thanks to Sabina Scheck and Karen Weigert. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, fantastical folk art creatures make a debut at a local park. So please stay with us.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
From embroidered textiles to painted pottery to tooled leather goods, Mexico's folk art traditions burst with all the brilliant color and life of the country itself. Some of these traditions have origins reaching back centuries, but one beloved folk art form is not even 100 years old yet. The exuberantly imaginative, fantastical creatures known as alebrijes, which date back to the 1930s. The art form exploded in popularity when an alebrije named Pepita was featured in the 2017 Disney Pixar film Coco. Now, gigantic alebrijes made by master Mexican artisans have taken up residence in a west suburban park. Producer Erica Gunderson has this very big story.
Que es una pieza mágica, que es una pieza con sueños de nosotros.
Ellos nos van hablando, nos van diciendo, esto sí, esto no.
You're not dreaming. Giant, fantastical creatures like winged lemurs, two-headed dogs, and rabbit kangaroos are indeed frolicking among the flowers in Wheaton's Cantini Park. 18 monumental versions of the folk art known as alebrijes are in the park as part of an exhibit brought here by the Mexican Cultural Center DuPage in collaboration with Mesli Artist Collective in Mexico City.
Pues aquí tenemos a Tochtli, se llama así porque en náhuatl significa conejo y pues bueno, es como un conejo canguro con una cresta como de iguana.
If you've traveled to Mexico, you might have brought home an alebrije like this little cat as a memento. But the alebrijes on display at Cantini Park are much closer to the original artist's fever dream of fantastical creatures that existed only in his imagination. They're also a little bit bigger.
Y tanto las aletas como la calavera son inspiradas en los peces marinos que viven en la profundidad.
The artists say the inspiration for the intricate adornment on each alebrije can come from anywhere.
Yo me inspiro en la naturaleza para realizar un alebrije. Sí influye mucho tu estado de ánimo y siempre vas a plasmar tus sentimientos en lo que sientes en ese momento para pintar tu.
Este alebrije se llama bicéfalo, entre el bien y el mal. Viene inspirado en el yin yang, por eso tiene la cabeza peleando contra la otra, pero más que nada es como una pelea entre uno mismo, entre el bien y el mal que tienes con.
Arturo Zarate constructed his alebrije, a combination of toucan, jaguar, bull, and butterfly he calls the malucan, with recycled materials like paper and plastic bottles that he solicited through social media.
Tiene que ver mucho con las especies en peligro de extinción y la fascinación del ser humano por apropiarse de otras especies de animales que deberían de ser libres. Claro, toda mi obra, mi producción y mi lema es el 90% de la producción es reciclado, porque es importante cuidar nuestro medio ambiente. convivir en armonía con los animales. Las personas mexicanas, los latinos, tenemos mucha resiliencia y mucha fuerza, entonces es empoderar todo lo que significamos.
The visiting artists say they hope their big and brilliant alebrijes will inspire people to learn more about Mexico's many artistic traditions.
De hecho, lo que nosotros venimos a mostrar aquí en Chicago es solamente una pequeñísima parte de todo lo que hay en México.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Erica Gunderson.
Alebrijes, Creatures of a Dream World, opens to the public at Cantini Park this Sunday. The festivities will include artist events, folkloric dance performances, and food trucks. The exhibit will be on display at Cantini Park through October, and you can find more about that on our website. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, our Spotlight Politics team looks at the kinder, gentler, sweater side of mayoral politics. Not sweatier, but sweater. Trumpet player Orbert Davis on reimagining classic works by jazz great Miles Davis, including Sketches of Spain. And is Chicago really a bicycle-friendly city? We take a look at bike infrastructure and safety. But first, some more of today's top stories. The permit for the Aurora Pride Parade has been pulled, which organizers say now prohibits the parade from taking place. The group Aurora Pride says in a statement the Aurora Police Department claims it cannot supply enough sworn police officers to provide parade security. Aurora Police said privately run special events require officers to work outside regularly assigned duties, and the city cannot, quote, force workers to work any overtime shifts or extra jobs. Organizers say their position has been misrepresented, and they're making every effort to keep the parade going as scheduled. A Chicago police officer who got into a confrontation last year with a black woman walking her dog has resigned from the department. That's according to the Sun-Times. Cell phone video went viral showing Officer Bruce Diker grabbing Nikita Brown and threatening to handcuff her while she was walking her dog on North Avenue Beach last August. The officer resigned last month before any formal disciplinary charges were imposed. The Civilian Office of Police Accountability wrapped up its investigation in October and passed its recommendations to Police Superintendent David Brown. Brown's decision has been passed along to the city's law department for review. More than 77,000 pounds of bananas on display broke a world record today, not in the tropics, but right here in the suburbs. Jewel Osco and Westmont teamed up with Fresh Del Monte to break the Guinness World Record for largest fruit display. It took 3 days to create this display, which ended up having more than 211,000 bananas. Bananas were later given to customers and donated to the Northern Illinois Food Bank. That story is bananas. Chicago's mayoral campaign is off to the races as Mayor Lori Lightfoot makes it official. We'll talk about that and so much more in our Spotlight Politics. And joining us now are Heather Sharon and Amanda Vinicky. Welcome back to the broadcast, my friends. So, Heather Sharon, you were following Mayor Lightfoot's barnstorming tour across the city. What was the reaction like?
Well, I'm not sure that she came in contact with absolutely anyone who wasn't vetted and holding a campaign sign. These events were highly scripted and tightly controlled, and it's clear that the mayor did not want to be confronted with protesters, although there was one protester at the last event at the Sidekick in Lakeview, in North Halsted, I should say, that was upset about her recent comments about whether those charged with violent crimes should be held before trial and whether they're guilty. So that was clearly what the mayor was trying to avoid.
Certainly controversial comments she made there a few days back, and challengers have been hitting her for her brash style, which she addressed in her campaign kickoff video. Take a look.
They say I'm tough.
Today, Mayor Lightfoot doubled down.
They say I get angry.
She's had some tough battles.
They say sometimes I take things personally. You know what I say? They're absolutely right.
Amanda Vinicky, it reminds you of any other mayor who ran for re-election trying to acknowledge some of the things that might have rubbed people the wrong way?
Paris, you're referring, I think, to that fuzzy sweater ad that former Mayor Rahm Emanuel became famous, maybe infamous for, perhaps, where he tried to kind of present himself as warm and fuzzy, like the sweaters that I do admittedly really like to wear, and sort of fessing up, talking to voters from as if they're real. It's similar in that regard because I think Lightfoot, as you see in that ad, is trying to sort of acknowledge some of the things that we hear about her often, as Heather talked about earlier, the personality that we've all come to know as somewhat temperamental, brash. But she did it in a different way. She's saying, yes, I am. And you want me to be sort of leaning into the notion that she talks about, that some of this is criticism she says she believes she faces because she is a Black woman, that former mayors who had equally maybe temperamental reactions didn't quite get the same sort of pushback as she does. Now, again, critics will say that that is certainly not their problem with Lightfoot. It is with her policy. And yes, when you have a personality, that means that you can't cooperate, compromise with members of the city council and other figures within Chicago. But that's what she's trying to do here.
I remember Rahm Emanuel saying, and this was during the runoff, saying, I rub people the wrong way. I own that. So kind of similar sentiment here in this re-election video. There was an election last night, a few elections across the country, but specifically in Los Angeles, a primary election, Heather, where a former Republican businessman went to a runoff against Congresswoman Karen Bass to become the next mayor of Los Angeles. And then you also had the recall of a very progressive prosecutor who is Chicago-born, but the prosecutor in San Francisco. And the folks in San Francisco cited the high crime for the reasons for the recall. Does those results echo here in Chicago at all?
I certainly think everybody thinks that's a distinct possibility, and that was one of the reasons we certainly heard Mayor Lightfoot say that crime and public safety was her #1 priority today, and if she wins a second term. I do think that these high-profile cases, tend to sort of scrub off the local issues. So in another lifetime, I covered politics in San Francisco and the Bay Area. Next door to San Francisco is Alameda County, where Oakland is. They elected a progressive prosecutor yesterday. At the same time, Chesa Boudin was recalled. And of course, now that the LA mayor's race is going to a runoff, Rick Caruso, the businessman you mentioned, will face a significant challenge from Karen Bass, who's really embraced progressive politics in Los Angeles. And during this first round of voting, he was really the only conservative candidate, and the vote may have sort of split up among the different progressives. The second round could be very different.
Right, the runoff might be telling.
All politics. Sorry, I was just all politics is local. I really want to touch on that. I think Heather is right that we can kind of pontificate and say, hey, does this apply to Chicago? Nonetheless, you certainly have campaign managers and candidates who are eyeing that, and so it does reverberate in the city campaigns. I think in state campaigns as well, the gubernatorial race, you're seeing a lot of talk about crime, and candidates all trying to feel things out.
You're right, Amanda. I mean, each city is different. I think Philly re-elected a progressive prosecutor, and the demographics of these cities are different, so it doesn't necessarily portend what's going to happen in Chicago. But I just wonder, Mayor Lightfoot made her first campaign all about police reform, pushing for the Civilian Police Oversight Agency. I wonder if this campaign is going to be more a pro-police, pro-law enforcement type of campaign, just given the crime issues in the city. Also, she's going to have to appoint a new alderperson for the 24th Ward, Heather, as Michael Scott left to take a job at Cinespace. So who are the candidates so far?
Well, there are 19 people who have tossed their proverbial hat into the ring, including Monique Scott, Michael Scott's sister, as his chief of staff, and Creative Scott, who's not related to either Scott, who held the alderperson seat, but who finished second in the 2019 aldermanic election. So there will be a number of candidates that the mayor and her screening committee will now have to sort through. She's got a couple weeks to make a decision, but whoever gets the nod will get a leg up if they choose to run for a full term in 2023. And that, of course, Paris, we've seen it time and again, alder people resigning, appointing their favored successor, and helping them sort of get a head start. That could certainly be what's happening here.
Not just alder people, it happens at all levels of politics. It happens at the General Assembly all the time, as you both know. Another former alderperson, Patrick Daley Thompson, he's convicted. He's asking for no prison time for his tax evasion charge. Prosecutors want 2 years. Amanda, where do you think the judge is going to fall here?
I always hesitate to put myself in the hands of anybody wearing a robe, but I am going to venture nonetheless that, of course, that's what Daley's team is hoping for, pushing for. They say that he has faced plenty of punishment as is, in the sense that he was stripped of his aldermanic seat, the Daley name drug through the mud, that he isn't able to, vote too, as we talked about earlier. Felony conviction, you can't have a gun in Illinois legally. So he's facing a whole lot there, but we're going to find out in July where the judge comes down. I do think that there's certainly a sentiment on the part of the judiciary, as we've seen in other recent corruption cases, to crack down. If you are a public official, you are held to a higher standard, period.
No doubt about that. Let's talk about the governor's race on the Republican side. Aurora Mayor and gubernatorial candidate Richard Irvin. The campaign had some news today. They're going to change their advertising strategy. We know they have so many ads up, funded by those tens of millions of dollars from Ken Griffin. So what's going to be different about their strategy going forward, and why the change, Amanda?
So they are still up in air in Chicago. So for those of you who, when Chicago Tonight isn't on, turn away from WTTW and are catching loads of those commercials when you're watching your favorite show on a commercial station, or another favorite show, that is, on a commercial station, they're not going to go away. It's really downstate that these ads have been pulled. And the campaign says, hey, the voting electorate is really in Chicago, at least 52% of it. I think you can read this, perhaps, however, as a sign that they're sort of ceding to downstate, where despite a lot of attempts by the Urban campaign to paint folks like Bailey and Sullivan as anti-Trump and as Democrats in disguise, that they aren't working. That said, Griffin still has money to play with. What he's running out of is time.
So ceding downstate to folks like Bailey or Sullivan, who maybe they think will win the downstate vote, but there's a huge chunk of voters in the Chicago metro area. And then also we learned today, Heather, that Aurora is, at least for the time being, pulling the permit for its Pride Parade because it can't get police officers. And Mayor Irvin kind of got involved a little bit in this kerfuffle. What's going on here?
Well, so this all started when Richard Irvin said that he would not march in the Pride Parade because organizers had asked Aurora police officers to not wear their uniforms during the event. And Mayor Irvin said, well, if they're not invited, I'm not coming. And that has really led to an issue where the city and the police department says that it's essentially 20 officers short to make sure that this parade goes off without a hitch and everybody is safe. However, without those officers, and that's certainly sort of part of this hubbub, volunteering to work overtime has left it in a little bit of a lurch. I think this is another indication that, issues of gay rights and sort of pride parades have become far more political and far more controversial than they were last year, the year before. And it's an indication, I think, of what a hot button issue this particular issue is for somebody running for statewide office as a Republican.
And we should mention that we obtained text messages that Irvin had sent to a city employee. We presented that exclusive story a couple weeks ago where he talked about his distaste for Donald Trump back then in 2019. Also in those text messages, he defends having a pride parade, saying that he's going and really kind of has a passionate defense and support for that parade back in 2019. So another instance where the gubernatorial candidate Irvin is a bit at odds with Mayor Irvin, or at least his record in Aurora. All right, we're going to leave it there.
Also trying to really show another hot button issue, again, that is crime, the issue of law enforcement, and Irvin signaling, quote unquote, support for the blue. Right. So a lot of politics at play here. All right, we will leave it there now. My thanks to Heather Sharon and Amanda Vinicky. Thanks very much. And a reminder that Illinois' primary election is 3 weeks away. Be sure to check out our 2022 voter guide that launched this week. And there you can hear from the candidates in their own words on why they want your vote. You can also find your polling location on Election Day. It's all at WTTW.com/voter guide. And up next, the legendary legacy of Miles Davis. But first, we take a look at the weather.
Jazz great Miles Davis is the focus of an ambitious concert this weekend at the Kay Center for the Arts in the Austin community. It's part of a new partnership between the Chicago Jazz Philharmonic and the Arts Center. And joining us to talk about it are trumpeter Orbert Davis, artistic director of the Chicago Jazz Philharmonic, and Vanessa Stokes, director of the Kay Center for the Arts. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. Orbert Davis, in your case, welcome back. I'm such a fan of yours, and this sounds like an amazing concert on Sunday. So you're going to do two iconic Miles Davis albums, Kind of Blue and Sketches of Spain. One you're going to do with your sextet and the other with the Jazz Philharmonic. What are the legacy of these two works?
Oh my goodness, how much time do we have? Well, first of all, I think pretty much everyone knows that Kind of Blue. I think everyone has Kind of Blue, but it's probably the one CD that many people were introduced to jazz for the first time. It's the highest selling jazz record of all time. I just find it's miraculous because at the time, the country was literally falling apart because of pre-civil rights and all the anger and hostility in the nation, but yet Miles Davis puts out the coolest record of all time.
And a record that's just so much, it's so iconic, so many iconic songs, and his playing is just so emotive. Vanessa Stokes, we mentioned this is happening in Austin at the Kay Center. This is a new cultural center. Tell us about it and what your goals are.
So first, thank you so much for inviting me and having me here today. And it's great to be in the presence of Orbert Davis too. And so I'm an Austin resident. I live in Austin on the west side, and over the past few years, there's a lot of really amazing just new things happening in the community, and one of them is the Kay Center for the Arts. So a few years ago, we were fully funded to create a $5 million completely renovated state-of-the-art theater on the west side, and it is one of the most beautiful and most amazing landmarks that we have within our city. And it was empty for 50 years, for a very long time. And it's connected to a school, Catalyst School, and that school and the folks at the school just thought it was a great time to renovate it for the school. And in this process, realized that this is gonna be just an amazing community space. So I stepped inside in 2019 and was blown away. I felt like I was downtown Chicago, and I literally bugged them until they put me on the board, because a space like this in the community on the west side, it hasn't been seen in decades.
And obviously, and Orbert Davis, you're an important partner here. You've played. You played at the Symphony Center. You played at the Pritzker Pavilion. Why was it important for you to partner up with the Kay Center?
Well, we went through a process a few years ago of kind of a identity crisis, if you will, of figuring out who we are and what is third stream, the blending of classical and jazz. And we came to understand that whatever we do, whether it be in education or in performance, change happens. Change in lives, change in community, change in the creative practice, and change in the dialogue, between musicians, between the audience. But what didn't make sense for us was that, we think of the concept change is what you get when you pay for something. But when we played at various downtown locations, tickets were $50. So how do we create change for the community if it's not accessible to the community? So right when I heard about the Kay Center, that's probably around the time COVID hit, but it was always in the back of our mind that we need to get into the community and perform and make it accessible for everyone, because that's what music should be. And thanks to our generous funders, we're able to do that, and provide this amazing opportunity for the community.
And Vanessa Stokes, as I understand, the tickets are the low price of $1. Is that correct?
That is correct. They are $1.
And how important is it to have this kind of programming at Kay to have Orbert Davis, a musician of his caliber, to play Miles Davis classics?
I think this is the thing that is missing in communities on the South and West Side is is culture. And we have to go outside of our community to go see things like this and to hear music like this. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to come together. It's an opportunity for musicians that have been in the city, iconic musicians, to come to the community and to share in their process, in their music. I think it's a perfect opportunity for us to collaborate and to work together.
All right, so Orbit Davis, you described one of the albums, Kind of Blue, obviously the most iconic or top-selling jazz album of all time. And then there's the jarringly different Sketches of Spain. So what is the legacy of Sketches of Spain to you?
Oh my goodness. It's been a piece that has haunted me for most of my adult life. I first performed it with Chicago Jazz Ensemble under the direction of Bill Russo. And I always say that I played the role of Miles Davis, because when Miles Davis approaches any music, it's very difficult for someone to emulate that. You know, it's without being even sarcastic to sound like Miles. But then, you know, there's a criticism of going one's own way when Miles set the pace already. But I've spent years and years studying it, not only as a trumpet player, but as an arranger. I think that piece is it's the center of where jazz meets classical music. You know, the incredible writing of Gil Evans and the phenomenal performing of Miles Davis. There are moments in the trumpet part where it's hard to tell whether Miles is improvising or if Gil Evans actually wrote it. So I took a lot of liberties myself with the first and fifth movement, but then more so in the second, third, and fourth movement, where I kind of dissected what they wrote and included two originals and a string quartet, and also changed the instrumentation as well.
And this goes
because
to the
I
heart
think jazz also has to move toward, you know, the future as well. You know, the classical part of us wants to play exactly what has been played before us, but the jazz part is innovative.
And famously, I mean, Miles Davis didn't want his players to rehearse that much before because he wanted total freedom. So how difficult is it to achieve that total freedom when trying to pay homage to the original product?
Well, all I can say is I have the right guys with me that understand the process. It's really playing third stream is being third stream, you know, classical and jazz. And fortunately, I have a history of being a studio musician. When any given day I was called to do anything, whether it sound like Miles or sound like Freddie Hubbard or Louis Armstrong or even, you know, the trumpet section of Earth, Wind and Fire. So, and so it wasn't, and classical as well. So it wasn't foreign to, you know, to be different all the time. So I think it's, you know, what we hear, and well, I'll tell you a quick story. For Kind of Blue, we did a concert maybe a couple years ago where we took the Kind of Blue and said, you know what, let's just create a new kind of blue on the spot. And I decided for this concert to use the arrangement that we did for that. So we're taking the 5 Miles Davis pieces and playing them in totally different styles. But I think that's what we have in jazz.
I feel like that's what he would have wanted. All right, we'll look forward to these shows. Our thanks to Orbert Davis and Vanessa Stokes. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
And Sketches of Blue, an Orbit Davis tribute to Miles Davis, is this Sunday. More details on our website. And up next, a conversation about bicycle infrastructure and safety, hosted by Michael Puente from WBEZ, that first aired on Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices. So please stay with us.
The inconsistent patchwork of protected bike lanes can make Chicago streets a dangerous place for bicyclists. From 2012 to 2019, an average of 5 to 6 bicyclists were killed every year in Chicago. But since the pandemic began in 2020, that number has ticked upward to 9 deaths in 2020 and 10 deaths in 2021. So far this year, 3 bicyclists have been killed by cars. And the Chicago Metropolitan Planning Agency reported a 25% jump in serious injuries to cyclists and pedestrians from 2020 to 2021. But despite the city's stated plans to do more to protect cyclists, transit advocates say there is a long way to go to make the streets a welcoming place for bikes. Joining us now with more are Lena Guerrero Reynolds, a Northwest Side resident and avid bicyclist, Audrey Winnick, Director of Transportation at the Metropolitan Planning Council, and Ruth Rosas, a bicycling advocate with the Transportation Equity Network. Lena, let's get started with you. You're a bike commuter near a Northwest Side intersection that has been the site of 2 cyclist fatalities in recent years. Do you feel safe on your daily commute?
You know, it's scary when stuff like that happens because it could be any one of us, right? And it's sad too for the families that have lost someone. I still think that biking is like the best way to get around town. It's so efficient, it's so affordable. And I just want it to be safer so that we don't have to see tragedies like this happen in our neighborhoods.
Ruth Rosas, what are your thoughts on the Lightfoot administration's approach to bike infrastructure in Chicago?
I think it will be a really great idea if they do actually go forward with a lot of the plans to expand the bike network. But I do think that a lot of equitable practices need to be embedded into the actual creation of bicycle infrastructure, making sure that neighborhoods that have been marginalized and left out of creating bicycle lanes in their communities or have been left out or invisibilized in the bicycling community really need to be sought out for their input, especially with everything that has happened in the last 2 years, making sure that, equity is at the forefront.
Now, Audrey, what role do you see aldermen playing in advocating for bicyclist protection?
Aldermen can be a definite force for good when they are supportive of bike lanes. And we would hope that they understand the value of installing protected bike lanes as much as possible so that cyclists are not riding only with a stripe of paint as their protection, but ideally have a concrete protected bike lane so that they feel truly safe and people of all ages and abilities come out and ride.
Okay. Now, Lena, what steps have you taken to avoid dangerous routes while cycling, and is it different in the summer, say, compared to winter?
Yeah, I've definitely gone pretty far out of my way, especially if I know I'm riding later at night or on weekends when people are more likely to be, intoxicated behind the wheel. And we shouldn't have to do that in order to take the lakefront trail or the off-street trails. It can be miles out of our way. And, when people are trying to use biking as a form of transportation to get to their stores, to their schools, to their families' houses, we need infrastructure that's safe everywhere, throughout the city and not just in these edges and distant places that are hard to make it part of your everyday life.
Now, Ruth Rosas, how has the pandemic, in your view, impacted cycling patterns and traffic safety?
I think a lot of people that weren't maybe previously cycling in the city sought out cycling as a form of getting around because they were afraid of maybe being in public transit during the pandemic, or they wanted to be outside. And so many people went out to bike shops and got bikes. That changed a lot of access to cycling for so many people, but also the expansion of the Divvy network also allowed people to access bikes that previously didn't or did not have bike stations.
Now, Audrey, do you think Chicago's government actually views bicycling as transportation versus just, say, recreation?
Well, there are a number of plans that do say the right things. The Chicago Department of Transportation has a new strategic plan. The Climate Action Plan lists shifting people to sustainable modes as an important strategy. However, there's also a complete streets design guidelines policy. And what that means is prioritizing, who's the priority on each street. And that hierarchy is supposed to be pedestrians are number 1, transit's number 2, cyclists are number 3, and cars are last. And so that would mean that the way you allocate street space, the way you manage speeds, the way you design roads would make it more comfortable and safer. Again, prioritizing the more vulnerable users, transit users, pedestrians, and cyclists. And I think those design guidelines have been around for over a decade. And I don't think most people would say that on most streets it feels that way.
Now, Lena, as a bike commuter, how do you think car drivers regard you on the street?
It depends. I mean, there's definitely dangerous folks out there and aggressive folks. But, you know, everybody makes mistakes and can be distracted on the road. And we should have infrastructure that accounts for that and that keeps people safe, even in dangerous, you know, conflicting sorts of situations.
Well, our thanks to Lena Guerrero-Reynolds, Audrey Winnick, and Ruth Rosas. Back with more Chicago Tonight right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabie family, the POLK Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Wednesday night. Please join us tomorrow night at a special time, 9 o'clock. Analysis of the primetime hearing on the January 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill. And a Native American affordable housing development is coming to Irving Park, the first in Chicago. That and much more is part of our In Your Neighborhood series. Again, that'll be tomorrow night at 9 after PBS NewsHour live coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives. Next on WTTW.
PBS presents True Colors LGBTQ+. Our stories, our songs. Join us as we celebrate the stories, songs, and history of the LGBTQ+ community, featuring Cynthia Nixon, Indigo Girls, Andre DeShields, and more.